Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Eleanor Nichovater and this is going to be my April wrap-up. I had a bit of a fail in April. I think we can all agree that I read a lot last month in March because of the Femathon and just because I was so hyped for reading. I was buddy reading books with my friends and it was great fun. So I was a bit burnt out with April and I had lots of other stuff going on in my personal life. So I didn't really read an awful lot, and especially at the tail end of this month I kind of fell off the bandwagon, but I still read some great books that I'd like to talk about. The first book I want to talk about was Rise by Myra Grant, and this was a short story collection, part of the Newsflesh series I buddy read with Faye and Kayla. I'll leave their channels linked below. We did a live stream wrap up of this whole Newsflesh world that we read all the books for. I'll leave that linked below as well if you didn't watch it live, where we discuss all the things we loved about each of these books in this world. And we both agreed that this was a great addition to the world. It's got 2 novellas in here and the rest are short stories, and they're not all set after the original trilogy. Some is set after with certain characters to see like what happened next, and some of them are set before. So within the original trilogy there's little stories mentioned, parts of history, things that are referenced, and some of these stories cover that, and I think it's done so well. This book is very much like a kind of historical document, detailing certain parts of that world. I never said that if you don't know. It's a zombie story. So the first book is Feed, and you're following a group of bloggers who are helping a candidate run for president in America during like a zombie apocalypse. It's like the 25-30 years after their initial outbreak, and life goes on. So this was just part of that. So some of these stories were right at the very beginning when the Rising first started and people didn't know what was going on, so the chaos from that. And then some are set in the middle where there's some rules in place and things go wrong and why other rules are then implemented. And then some stories are following our beloved characters from the original trilogy after the fact. What are they doing next? And I loved it. It was fantastic. Great addition. Just in this weird American mass market paperback science that doesn't match any of my other books, because this is a weird mutant book and it's way longer than you'd expect. So I had great fun reading this. The next book I read was Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. I really enjoyed this. This is another standalone book in the Discworld series where you're following a character who works as in a kind of monastery, I should say, and you all worship this god called Om, and those people like to go out and kind of be missionaries to other towns and cities, and they take them over and kind of force them to follow their religion. But something goes wrong, and you're also following this tortoise who is the god Om, who came to Earth and came down as a tortoise because he didn't realise that he only had one believer left. He thought he had thousands because all these people worship him. But it's a larger discussion about this religion who all worship this god Om, but there's actually only one true believer, because over time they've all just kind of fell away from the true meaning of the religion and what they're believing in, and they end up just believing in each other's and the rules, following the rules rather than the actual kind of overall idea of religion. So it's a really interesting story, and in Terry Pratchett's usual style, very comedic, and it's also got an appearance with some philosophers and things like that, and it's just a very interesting discussion about organised religion, but at no point did I ever think it was mocking and disrespectful for other organised religion. I think it really points out that some people take things to the extreme, and it's good to acknowledge that, and I love doing it and doing that within Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I think it's just very fun. As usual, I'll leave all of my individual book reviews linked in the cards and in the description if you're wanting more information. The next book I read was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I really enjoyed this. It was a slow start for me just because it is a classic fantasy and it takes a little bit of time to get used to the language and the format of the story. But I really enjoyed this. The characters were really interesting. They had a really good arc, and it was more nuanced than just fighting a big bad. I can't say why because spoilers, but I just found it really interesting that at the end of it, it answered a deeper question about who people are as a person for this main character. I thought the world was really interesting. It's very detailed. It's called Earthsea, so it's 1,001 tiny islands. and all these people live and travel between all these islands. And I just thought it was a really fantastic world. Really enjoyed this. Very short, quick book, but it did take me a while to read because it's classic. But I'm really interested to pick up the rest of the books in this series, and to pick up more books by Ursula K. Le Guin, because she's lauded as this amazing fantasy and science fiction classic writer, and I haven't read by her before, so I'm excited to pick up more of her books. The next book I read was Marked by PC and Kristen Cast, the first book in the House of Night series. I read this as part of the Red Bird read-along that's being hosted by a few people that I know here on YouTube, and I would always take an opportunity to reread the series. I believe they're doing monthly live shows for each book, so I'm hoping in the next few days they've got their live show for Marked. I'm excited to watch that. If you've been on my channel for a while, you know I started doing rereading my Teen Vampire Obsession series. Still have a few videos to film for that. I'll need to get back to it. They're just very time consuming to make. So this is the second time I've read this book in like a year, which is ridiculous. But I used to be able to practically recite this book. I've read it dozens of times, especially when I first read it as a teenager. This is a very old, early 2000s vampire series. So it's a really good story. I love the kind of plot of the story through the series. It does get a bit ridiculous at points, but reading it again as an adult, and especially with today's modern lens, there is a lot of flaws with this book. There's language used that is not appropriate for today's age, and I don't even know if it was appropriate at the time. I think it was more the words were used in a kind of slang, derogatory way in people's internal monologue and out loud that aren't appropriate. I'm not going to say them here. If you're interested, you could maybe look them up or whatever. They aren't appropriate nowadays to say things like that about people, even in your own internal monologue. And it happened more often than I remembered it happening. And yeah, and you're reading through a teenager's lens. So they're 16 years old, and everything's very self-absorbed, if that makes sense, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just weird to read that when you're 10 years older. It's a bit strange, but overall I do love this world. I love how the vampires are in this book. I think they're very interesting, and I'm hoping they continue on with the read along, at least a few more books, and because I never finished the series, I don't think I ever read the last book. But yeah, I did enjoy reading this, even with its flaws, but I can see the flaws because I know and love the series so much. I can read past them with acknowledging them. The next book I read was Murder Games by James Patterson. I read this super quickly. I read it in 2 days, which with the way the rest of my reading month's gone is a bit of a surprise. This is my first James Patterson book because I don't really read crime fiction, certainly not when it's from the lens of like detectives and stuff like that. I can't say too much about it because it's crime. It's set in New York. You're following a professor at Yale University who's been asked to help with the investigation because his book was found with the murder victim, and it goes on from there. I wouldn't say this was particularly complicated or allowed for a lot of puzzling out of the reader, but I did enjoy the characters and I enjoyed the fast-paced format, and that propelled me through the book rather than the complex plot. But this was based, but I read this one because I liked the TV show that was made based on this book, Instinct, which was cancelled after 2 seasons. I'm not surprised. But I enjoyed it regardless. So I read that last book a week ago, and I haven't read anything since. You can tell by my bullet journal here, I just tapered off. I basically took a week off from reading, kind of accidentally, but also just still kind of burnt out, and I'm not really sure what I wanted to pick up next. But I did enjoy the books I have read so far in April. I just kind of died a death at the end, but you know, you need to have breaks, otherwise you burn out completely. But I did enjoy all the books I read this month. What are some of the books you've read recently that you've really enjoyed? Have you read any of the books I've talked about today? I'd love to chat with you in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.